Yeah, hello again, class. Today, 22nd of April 2019, we are taking on our second lecture. We had a very exciting first lecture. I have no doubt whatsoever that we'll have an equally exciting second lecture. By the way, we are moving away from Africa and we are going to the US. We're going to Indianapolis. And you will see that. Please fasten your seatbelts as we take on the second lecture, which is on liberation, science education, and the future of African people, by no other than Professor Jomo Mutegi, who is in Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, US. So who is Jomo Mutegi? Jomo W. Mutegi is an associate professor of science education at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, IUPUI, and principal investigator of the ES2 STEM Learning Lab. His research aims to better understand and disrupt systemic racism in the STEM education of people of African descent. His research appears in several respected journals, including Journal of Research in Science Teaching, Science Education, Teachers College Record, Science and Children, and the Science Teacher. He's an active member in the National Association of Research in Science. By the way, he's just being modest. He's a member of the board, executive board of NAST, and the Indiana Evaluation Association. Dr. Mutegi has received over $3.6 million US in external grant funding. It's my pleasure, to now invite Professor Jomo Mutegi to address us. Jomo, you have the floor. So over to you, Professor Jomo Mutegi.
I first want to begin by thanking Peter for inviting me to share with you today. This invitation really means a lot to me. As educators and as researchers, we often spend a lot of time reading, observing, writing, and trying to figure out how we can be of better service to others. Sometimes we have the benefit of seeing the fruits of our labor, but very often we never get that opportunity. We never get to learn whether and to what degree we've impacted others. So an invitation like this is an encouraging reminder that someone finds benefit in this work, and I thank you for that. Today it is also an extra special day for me because it marks a special anniversary in my career history. 25 years ago, the 68th NARS annual conference was held in San Francisco, California. Now that conference ran from April 22nd to April 25th, and that was in 1995. I was at that time a 25-year-old doctoral student, and that was my very first NARS conference. As a new attendee, I signed up for the NARS mentoring session. And my assigned mentor was Dr. Peter Okebukala.
Thank God. We've gone way back. Yeah, thank you.
Do you remember that?
I remember that, of course, yeah.
Yes. So the mentoring session is always held on the first day of the conference. So I first met Peter on this very day, April 22nd, 25 years ago. And I want to let everyone know that beginning with that conference and throughout the past 25 years, Peter has been a gracious mentor.
Thank you.
He's done for me what he has done for so many of us, and that has helped to provide a strong introduction into this research community, and also providing wise counsel throughout my research career. So I thank you for that, Peter.
Thank you.
When I first received the invitation to share with you, I took note of the course title, Trends in STEM Education and Research. And I asked myself, what trends in our field are of critical importance to people of African descent? And as I considered many of the prevailing trends, hands-on instruction, scientific inquiry, engineering practices, learning progressions, all of these trends pale in comparison to the need for liberation. And if you ask, is liberation a prevailing topic in STEM education? My answer would be no, but it really should be. So the subject I've chosen is liberation, science education, and the future of African people. And I've organized this lecture in two parts. In part one, I'll share an experience I had as part of a cross-cultural international partnership with our sister university in Kenya. And in part two, I'll draw from some of the insight generated in part one to suggest a set of principles to guide our efforts as we move towards liberatory STEM education. Part one, I'm calling Lessons from the Jewel Colony. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to travel to Eldoret, Kenya, with a contingent of 5 university faculty members. Our primary objective was to determine the feasibility of a study abroad arrangement that would allow pre-service teachers from the U.S. to have their student teaching experience in Kenya. And we were hosted by colleagues from Moi University, which, as I mentioned, is our sister university. In all, we spent 5 days visiting primary and secondary schools. Here you see a map of Kenya, and Eldoret is circled on that map. It's also a picture of Moi University. In many respects, Kenya and the United States are very different places. There are different languages, there are different foods, different cultures, and different customs. But this portion of our lecture is not about our differences, it's about our similarities. And here I will share 3. Also, I'll point out that at the bottom of this slide, you see a reference. Much of what I'm sharing in this first part of the lecture is available in an article that was published earlier this year. And I shared a copy of that article, a PDF of that article with Peter, and he can provide it to others.
Yes, I will.
Okay. So the first similarity is that science curriculum is structured to be irrelevant. And the portion of the experience that emphasizes for me, I'm calling Where is Your Garden? So we're in Kenya, in Eldoret, and the first school we visited was an elementary school. And I recall being impressed by the grounds. It was well manicured, it was expansive. The children and the staff all looked happy. It felt like a welcoming place. Early in the day, we met with the head of school, and she sat with our faculty members and wanted to provide an overview of the school. And of the many things she shared with our group, the one thing that stuck out with me was that students often come to school hungry. And so for the rest of my visit, I was nagged by this very practical problem that we as humans face. We all have to eat. And after that meeting, when I looked at the school grounds, I no longer saw how well manicured it was. All I could see is that there was no garden. Why would a school, so I'm asking myself this, why would a school with hungry children and plenty of arable land not have a garden? Elliot Eisner, who's a curriculum theorist, explains that schools can be structured in many different ways, and he frames these curriculum orientations. Academic rationalism is one of those orientations, and that describes the structure of schools in Kenya. Here, the objective is to teach disciplines that are most worthy of study. And we can put that in quotes because that's a subjective judgment, most worthy of study. This is the same curricular structure we use in the U.S. And when we are teaching p orbitals, Krebs cycle, cis versus trans isomers, our students ask, why do we need to know this?
Wow.
And we rarely have good answers for them. But the most accurate answer, if we dare to give it to them, is that the vast majority of what you will learn, you will never use. Some groups of scientists, along with a smattering of science education researchers, and an even smaller smattering of science teachers, regard this as the best knowledge that human beings have produced. So it makes the curriculum cut. Now, before I move on, I want to bring balance to our discussion. And I have to point out that hunger is not only an issue in Kenya. Although you might not be able to tell from watching, reading, or listening to Western media, a 2017 USDA report shows that 1 in 8 American households reports being food insecure. 1 in 7 1 in 7, that number 1 in 8 increases to 1 in 7 if we look at rural areas. It increases further to 1 in 6 if we look at households with children. It increases to 1 in 5 if we consider households headed by a single man, and 1 in 3 in households headed by a single woman. So gardens are just as much needed in American schools as they are in Kenyan schools. The second similarity is that science curriculum is profoundly inefficient. And the portion of the visit that emphasizes to me, I'm calling a good school. Now, this gardening thing must have really been bothering me because I ended up having a conversation with one of our faculty hosts, Lazarus Momani, about the lack of a garden. And I say we had a conversation. We actually had multiple conversations. And Momani explained to me that gardens are not prominent in the schools because they're not an essential part of the curriculum. The curriculum prioritizes subjects in which students will be tested. Well, this came as a bit of a shock to me. And I said, I understand this, but I'm talking about an elementary school. Do the elementary students take tests? And Momani explained to me that elementary age students test to get into secondary school.
Sure.
And secondary students test to get into university. He also explained that all students go on to the next level, but success on the test ensure that students go on to a top school at the next level. Without attending a top school, students can remain in school a bit longer, but they're unlikely to go much further. And so, being curious, I asked Momani, what percentage of students test well enough to move forward or to go to a top school? And he explained that at any level, about 10 to 20% score well enough to be competitive for a strong school. So if you look at this top graphic, we'll just do a little bit of mathematics. And let's see, hope you can see. Can you see my pointer?
Sure, I'm actually focusing.
Okay. So of all the primary school students, 20% score well enough to go forward to a top secondary school. Of all the secondary school students, 20% test well enough to go forward to a top post-secondary school. And of all those in post-secondary, this is university, 50% realize employment. And I didn't share this story, but we met some graduates of Moy University, and in meeting them and talking about some of their challenges post-graduation, we found that about half of the university graduates don't really attain employment. And so mathematically, if we multiply these numbers out, we find that 2% end up employed. Of all students going through this curriculum, 2% end up employed. So again, to bring balance to our discussion, I will point out that inefficiency is not only an issue in Kenya. In the U.S., and we can look at this bottom graphic here, if we look at all high school freshmen, only about 80% of them graduate. And then if we look at all high school graduates, only about 66% of them enter college. And if we look at all those who enter college, only about 59% graduate. If we look at all those bachelor degree recipients, only about 12.5% major in science. And of all STEM degree holders, only about 47% are employed in the area of their degree. And again, we multiply these numbers out, and the result is fewer than 2% of the population. Now, we could look at this attrition as a form of specialization, and in that sense, it's not a problem. But what I regard as problematic is that we are compelling 100% of the student population to master a canon of information that is only relevant, only beneficial to fewer than 2%. And we do that at the expense of providing the 98% with information that will be useful to them. So our third similarity is that the science curriculum does not produce the results it promises. And I'm calling this portion of our visit, Enter the Juakali. The upper left-hand corner, you see a picture of me talking with Momani, and then we have some pictures of different Juakali work areas. So throughout many of our conversations, Momani would make reference to, and he would emphasize the Juakali. And early on when I asked, what is a Juakali, he would respond, it's the informal sector. Well, I didn't know what to make of that. I wasn't sure what it meant. And so I didn't make much use of it cognitively. It never went beyond him relaying that simple explanation to me. Then one day, 3 of the IUPUI faculty took a drive with one of our hosts, Charles Nanducci. He took us to a remote girls' school, and the school was in a rural region, and it was a 3 to 4 hour drive from Eldoret. About halfway through our drive, the car started knocking like it was going to break down. Now, all I could envision was all the bad things that could happen if I got stranded in rural Kenya. And after a few miles, fortunately, Charles pulled up to a row of makeshift stalls. A man came to the car. Charles got out and spoke with him for a few minutes. The man opened the hood. Charles sat back in the car. And within 15 minutes, we were driving off, and the car was fine. Well, the IUPUI faculty, we were beside ourselves. This was unheard of to us. We hadn't seen anything like this before. Charles didn't make an appointment. The mechanic didn't order any parts. Charles didn't have to mortgage his house to pay the repair bill. And so we're asking, well, what in the world is this? And after we expressed our shock, Charles looked around the car at us. He smiled, and he said, "That's the Juakali." Juakali is sometimes called, they say it's Swahili for get her done, but literally it means working under the hot sun or hot sun, because the practitioners work in the open air. If 2% of students move through the educational system to employment, the question we can ask is what happens to the 98%? Well, according to a 2017 report from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, in 2016, 16 million Kenyans were employed. Of those 16 million Kenyans, 13.3 million, which is 83%, were employed in the informal sector, the Juakali. So the Juakali is not incidental to the Kenyan economy. The Juakali is the driver of the Kenyan economy. Now, again, in order to bring balance to our discussion, although we do have a few shade tree mechanics here in the U.S., we do not have an informal sector that rivals the Juakali. However, it is still the case that the science curriculum in the U.S. does not yield the results it promises. We say that we want students to be excited about and understand the natural world. We say that we want students to become adults who engage intelligently in public discourse around science topics. But the unfortunate reality is that most Americans, and by most I mean over 60%, most Americans do not know the major risk factors for cancer. Most Americans self-report little or no knowledge of GMOs. Most Americans have little or no knowledge of fracking. In fact, one study of the public understanding of science found that only 46% of Americans knew that the Earth goes around the sun once per year. Only 25% knew that antibiotics kill bacteria, but not viruses. And given the current COVID-19 pandemic, if you're following the news, the U.S. news around this pandemic, it should be clear that there is a pervasive and a profound ignorance of many basic STEM ideas. And this ignorance spans the entire spectrum of American public culture, from leaders in government and industry who are making decisions on down to the average citizens who have to follow the decisions. Unfortunately, our STEM ignorance in this instance is costing many people their lives. So what I work to make clear in my reflection on this experience, and what I want to give you as the first takeaway message, is that schooling in science and science curriculum in Kenya and the U.S. are similar in three ways. Number one, they're both structured to be irrelevant. Number two, they're both profoundly inefficient. And number three, neither produces the results they promise. Wow. Now, the second takeaway message may not initially be as transparent. At the same time, however, it should not be controversial. The shortcomings of Kenyan schooling and science curriculum are a direct reflection of the degree to which Kenyan schooling attempts to mirror Western schooling. So at this point, I want to hold on to those ideas as I transition into part two of the lecture. In part two, I'm referring to as three aspects of liberation through STEM education. Now, in order to bring order to my thoughts for this part, I framed the second part of this lecture around aspects of liberatory science education. I'm sorry about that. And there are three: the personal aspect of liberatory science education, the ideological aspect of liberatory science education, and the practical aspect of liberatory science education. Okay. Liberatory science education is personal. And the framing question I'm presenting you with is, why am I committed to liberation? And I'm asking that of myself, and then I would encourage you to ask that of yourself. Why are you committed to liberation? My goal here is simply to be openly self-reflective. I will not attempt to tell you what should drive you personally. Instead, I will share with you what drives me personally in hopes that it resonates with some of you. And this understanding should also provide more context for my work. I had a childhood experience that was formative for me. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and this was during the 70s and 80s. And during that time, the suburbs that made up Greater Cleveland were clearly demarcated by income. Let's see if I can show you where. So this is where I was in Cleveland, near to downtown. This is downtown Cleveland, and I lived here. And this is the high school I attended. This was Orange Village, which is a suburb of Cleveland. So the suburbs, and this you can tell from the schematic, the lighter shade is lower income, the darker shade is higher income. Now, the further a suburb was from the city center, the more affluent the suburb was. And as you can imagine, and probably would imagine, the suburbs are also clearly demarcated by race, so that the further a suburb was from the city center, the fewer Black people you would find in that suburb. Now, my home was in Glenville, which was about 7 to 10 minutes from downtown, and my school was in Orange Village, which was about 45 minutes southeast of downtown. So to get from home to school, we traveled through suburbs that represented a full range of socioeconomic statuses. And periodically, my mother would stop to buy groceries or other home items as we traveled from home to school, or from school to home. Even as a child, the disparity was clear to me. I recall asking her once, why are the stores in our neighborhood so messy and unclean, and the stores in their neighborhoods are so nice? And I don't remember what answer she gave me, if she ever even gave me an answer. Of course, our children don't realize this, but sometimes parents just want children to be quiet. And that may have been the response I got. However, I do remember that on at least one occasion, I told her that when I grow up, I'm going to build a nice store in our neighborhood. And although I don't build stores, my desire to have good things for people of African descent has been a driving ethos throughout my life and my work. The second experience that I'll share I had when I was a freshman in college. I was visiting I was visiting a friend in her dorm room, and she was a white female, and she had don't look at me like that, Peter. Don't look at me funny. Anybody who was there could have been on that visit with me. But anyway, she had a picture of Martin Luther King Jr. that was actually the outline of his silhouette. And when you got close enough to the picture, you could see that the picture was actually made from the text of one of his speeches. Well, there was another student there, a white male, who took note of the picture, and the two of them began to have a conversation about the philosophies of Dr. King and of Malcolm X and in their work. And as I shrank into the background, I reflected on the fact that I had not read either King nor Malcolm X. At the same time, I knew nothing of their philosophies. I knew nothing of their life's work, their contribution to history. And here were two white students who read more about and knew more about noted Black leaders than I did. And that day, I decided that I would study Black history. So shortly thereafter, I went to the mall and I got the autobiography of Malcolm X. And that was the first book I read that I would consider a Black history book. I couldn't put the book down. I skipped classes for about a week. All I did was eat and read. And for me, the book was like black dynamite, like somebody put a stick of dynamite in my mind and set it off. And after the dust settled, my worldview was reoriented. I began to look at everything, customs, holidays, religious practices, even myself, in a historical context. To use Donaldo Macedo's framing, I began to read the world and not just the word. And that was a formative experience that shapes my thinking and work even to this day. And out of that experience, I developed a Pan-Africanist worldview. So to summarize, liberatory science education is personal. And at this point, I'll put the question to you. Why are you committed to liberation? Now, this is a rhetorical question. And I suppose we probably should first ask, are you committed to liberation? And if the answer is yes, then we can go to our question and say, why then are you committed to liberation? Having a clear sense of why we want liberation is the first step to understanding what we believe liberation to be. Now, one of my favorite scenes from a movie, from the movie Roots, is a scene where Fiddler is given charge of making Kunta Kinte into a slave. And if the technology will allow, I'm going to show a clip. And in this clip, we're going to see two very different notions of freedom. So bear with me and let me see if I can get this to play.
Yeah, that's your African name. Must have give you a new name. Must have said, your name, Phillip. What's the matter with you? Cut me loose. Okay. You Africans all alike. Crazy. Must have said your name is Toby. That's who you is. He owns you. He can do anything he wants with you. There ain't nothing you can do about it. I've been scratching and scrambling most of my days to get where I got. Now I eat in the big house kitchen. I got pine boards on the floor of my cabin. And it don't take much coughing for the master to make me have a cup of corn whiskey for my medicine. Now that is fine living for a nigga, and I'll be damned if any African Guinea man is gonna make me lose all I've been working for. Now you take my meaning? You don't speak the King's English, fella. You better learn. You Toby. You best learn or you're gonna get the bloody back to show. And me too, maybe. Get out there.
When we say that liberatory science education is also ideological, the question I'm asking is, what does liberation look like? For Fiddler's notion of freedom, Fiddler has one notion of freedom, and for Fiddler, slavery is a given. And freedom is a comfortable slave existence. So he says, I've been scratching and scrambling most of my days to get where I got. Now I eats in a big house kitchen. I got pine boards on the floor of my cabin. It don't take much coughing for master to give me a cup of corn whiskey. That's fine living. Fiddler does not seem to envision an existence where his well-being is not dependent on the goodwill of Master Reynolds. He doesn't envision an existence where he's autonomous. He doesn't envision an existence where he is self-determined. Kunta Kinte's notion of freedom, by contrast, is very different. For Kunta Kinte, he knows an authentic freedom. He knows a freedom that comes with autonomy, that comes with self-determination, that comes with the ability to live with nobody holding anything over you. Too often in our work as science educators, our stated goals reflect Fiddler's notion of freedom. We want to eliminate gaps in test scores. We want our children to do well so they can go to good colleges, which should be red, white colleges. We want our children to go to jobs with the very companies that exploit us at every turn. Our stated goals reflect the desire for a comfortable slave existence. The ideological standard that we should strive for is complete self-determination. We should work towards autonomy from non-African cultural, social, political, and economic structures. Autonomy does not necessarily mean isolation.
Sure.
Autonomy means that we are not dependent on those structures.
Sure.
We can use them if we so desire, or we can leave them alone if we so desire.
Yeah.
The ideological standard, in addition to striving for self-determination, the ideological standard we should strive for is African dominion. Once a few years ago, my older son was learning to drive. And at one point, it seemed to me that he was about to run us into a Jersey wall. Now, maybe I was a little more nervous than I needed to be. Maybe not. At any rate, I directed him to pull the car over, and I took back the wheel. I exercised dominion or sovereignty or control over that car. Transition to our current society. In 2015, an article in the journal Science reported that between 5 and 13 million tons of plastic enter the ocean every year. In 2015, the CDC put out a report that estimated that PFAS chemicals were in the blood of 90% of Americans. Over 18 million acres of forests are being destroyed each year. Hunger is more pervasive than it should be. Potable water is less available than it should be. I don't want to pin all of the world's ecological problems on one group of people, but much of the environmental degradation we see can be directly attributed to the global spread of Western-style industry. At some point, we need to take back the wheel, exercising dominion. And our third area here is that liberatory STEM education is practical. And here we're asking the question or addressing the question, how do we achieve liberation? The first suggestion I would offer is that we prioritize our own needs as African people. I have a recent study out, and I shared a copy of the study with Peter. The study of a nanotechnology camp. And in our evaluation of the study to report it back to the National Science Foundation, our quantitative researcher said we had great results. On the whole, students increased on every measure. Our qualitative researcher said, are you sure? Because from our observations, the Black students didn't have a very positive experience. The quantitative researchers went back to the data, disaggregated it by race, and found that the non-Blacks increased on many measures, whereas the Blacks either stayed the same or decreased on many measures. The default position in the framers of the camp, and which I was one, so I'm being self-critical as well, the default position was to establish a camp that met the needs of all the students, but it actually met the needs of all the students except for the African-American students. The idea that one camp, one curricular approach, or one school can meet the needs of all students equally is a false idea. As African people, we are uniquely situated socially, culturally, historically, and we need educational approaches that take that unique positioning into account and that meets our unique needs. A second practical step that we could and should implement is to exploit weaknesses in the social, cultural, and political landscape of European societies. In a book called The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, Nicholas Carr explains how internet technology encourages distraction and inhibits lack of depth in thought. He argues that this technology is causing us to lose our capacity for concentration, for reflection, and for focused thinking. In the years to come, people who craft an educational system that prioritizes depth of thought will have a decided advantage over those who can't concentrate. In another book, In Defense of Food, an Eater's Manifesto, Michael Pollan argues that the industrial Western food system is a major threat to human health and well-being. He argues that 5 of the top 10 causes of death are diet-related illnesses. Again, in the years to come, people who craft an educational system that rejects industrialized food and instead prioritizes natural, healthful production and distribution, food production and distribution, will have a decided advantage over those who embrace and consume industrialized food. In her book, The Truth About Drug Companies, How They Deceive Us and What You Can Do About It, Marcia Angel argues that the pharmaceutical industry is so heavily driven by a quest for profit that it's largely abandoned original research and focuses primarily on marketing of drugs that offer questionable benefits. And again, in the years to come, people who can craft an educational system that prioritizes health over profit will have a decided advantage over those who do not. If we spend our time and energy trying to replicate failed Western systems, then we will not be in in a position to be self-determined or to exercise dominion.
Correct.
And I'm coming near to my close, Peter.
5 minutes.
Okay, great. So our last practical step is to commit to establishing and maintaining free and independent STEM and STEM education infrastructure. If Africa closes doors to non-Africans today, the world will shut down tomorrow. The West needs tea from Kenya. They need coltan from the Congo. They need oil from Nigeria. They need bauxite from Guinea. They need coal from South Africa, diamonds from Botswana, uranium from Namibia. We could go on for hours with the various resources that they need from Africa. We have treasures overflowing in both Africa and in the diaspora. We are not poor, but neither are we a whore. And we don't exist for people to come in and take our treasures on the cheap. One way to stop this type of exploitation is to establish independent STEM and STEM education infrastructure. And as I enter into my conclusion, I want to reiterate, if we want STEM education that is relevant and that is irrelevant, inefficient, and fails to deliver on its promise, then we should strive to imitate or mirror Western educational practices. If we want STEM education that will lead to self-determination and dominion for African people, then we should prioritize our own needs as African people, we should exploit the weaknesses of Western culture, and we should establish independent African educational infrastructure. I'd like to now open up the floor for questions.
Thank you so very much, Professor Jomo Mutegi. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, and we will open the floor for just a minute now. We'll open the floor for discussion. We have 15 minutes, by the way. So the way I propose that we go is to begin from Nigeria. And I'd like to begin with myself. Just a minute now. Let me begin with myself. Jomo, I clearly recall our first meeting 27 years ago in San Francisco and the partnership that God has brought us together over the years. And I'd like to congratulate you on your excellent scholarship. And I'm delighted that you are now a member of the executive board, the board of directors of NAST, and are looking forward to when you be president. There was an opportunity before, but there'll be another opportunity for you to lead the whole of the STEM world as president of NAST. We now have a book which is driving one of our courses. It's an invention, cultural techno-contextual approach. By the time we were setting up our center and we made a proposal to the World Bank, the World Bank, I'm sure, is thinking along your lines. Because all of those people, all of those proposals that focused on, say, they want to try methods, all those Western methods, they just threw them in the bin. But because they saw something unique coming from Africa, coming from reflecting culture, they decided to give us a space as a center of excellence, and that's what is driving our center. So I'm going to send you a copy of the book, which was published only in January. Already given copies to Bill Kyle, who has spread it all over, in the U.S., and to Alejandro. So Bill Coburn is here. I can see he's present. If he can switch on his camera, that would be nice. He's addressing us next week. Bill, that's good. That's Bill there. Bill, wonderful. I can see you, Bill. It's going to be exciting to listen to your presentation next week. By the way, class, Bill Coburn, Bill, just say hello to us. First of all, say hello to all of us. Or mute your microphone and say hello to us.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you very loud and clear. Very loud and clear.
Good.
Yeah, that's good.
Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Yes.
It's early and it's chilly here in Michigan.
We send you some sun. We send you some sun.
Yeah, send me some heat.
Some heat. Now, Professor Asabe Kabir, are you still in class? I'm sure she is. Professor Asabe Kabir.
Are we?
Yeah, I'm sure she is. You know, several years ago, about 100 years ago, Bill Coburn was in University of Sokoto, that is now Usman Danfodio University. He was
That's right.
Yeah, he was a professor. You know, he came in to Sokoto almost like 1 million years ago. You know, so he knows the terrain very, very well. So, in conclusion, Jomo, I'm happy that you have triggered us, and I'm sure you are happy to know that we have also been triggered, and you made some statements which I just noted. Take back the wheel, and then exercise domain. So on that note, I will open the floor for starting from Nigeria, starting from our students. So if you want to take the floor, I can see Oladejo there. Yes, Oladejo, and who else is coming up? Tiffany, you got to talk. You got to speak. You are coming with the Jomo group. So Tiffany, if you can, I would like you to say a thing or two. So Oladejo, take the floor. Oladejo, take the floor.
Thank you very much, sir.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Professor Jomo, for the lecture. I just want to ask quickly, from your visitation to Kenya and the experiences you had there as an Afrocentric individual too, I'd like to know some of the suggestions that you made to Kenya so as to improve their system of the informal system as compared to the formal. Can you share with us some of those core recommendations that you made to them? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Now, one other from Nigeria. Yeah, I'm scrolling across. Okay, so let me take on. Yeah, the France is from. I think you're from Burundi. The France, you're from Burundi. Please take the floor.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank Professor Jomo for his excellent presentation. It was very, very important for me, and I think for everyone of us. I don't have a question, but I want to ask to Professor Jomo if he has more literature or books about the liberation and cultural techno-contextual approach. I know that Professor Okebukola gave us the book, but I think there is other writings about Africa, about education, about liberation. As I am very interested in this, I'd like to ask if Professor Jomo Mutegi can give us more literature or writings about his presentation. Thank you.
Yes, Jomo has promised, and he will. He said there are some articles that he will be sending to me, and I will share with all of you, and also some references that you may wish to get to see. Alade Okin, you have the floor. Briefly now. Yeah, can you unmute yourself? We can't hear you yet. Alade Okin.
Yes, sir. Thank you, my editor. I want to congratulate Professor Jomo on this wonderful presentation this morning.
Very good. Go on. Alade Okin, please go on. Okay, Alade Okin is not responsive. So, do we have any other student from DRC, Congo? I'm scrolling now. I can see Phillip. No, Phillip Alabi, you are Nigerian. Okay, you hold on. Let me see DRC. Anybody from DRC?
David.
Okay, David, you have the floor, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I thank the Professor Jomo for his presentation in education. He told us that we can exploit weakness in the social, cultural, and political from European. But my question is, in the context of Africa, among the education tools that we can use is a language. Which one can be a common for all the Africa country in case to explain our material in our own language?
Okay, thank you very much. What
From
David is asking is for Jomo to tell us what language we should adopt as a common language in a continent with thousands of languages. I can see Professor Michael over is shaking his head there, but maybe we have thoughts from Jomo. So let me see if Alade okay is not back. So do we have some other facilitators who are here? Do we have facilitators who are here who want to ask a question or make a comment? Did I see the CM? Are you raising your hand, CM? I can't hear you. CM, are you raising your hand? Yeah.
No, sir.
Okay, that's fine. That is good. All right. So before I yield to Jomo, let me ask Tiffany. Tiffany, do you want to say a thing or two?
I'm not sure if there's more than one Tiffany. Am I the only Tiffany on the call?
Yes, you are the only one. You are the only one. Yes.
Hi everyone. I'm very pleased to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I am a high school teacher in Chicago, Illinois, in the States. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, and I am also the mother of two boys. And I was actually going to have my younger son tested for a learning disability because he's just not tracking with the curriculum. But since we've had the closures due to COVID, he's a little maker, he's a little engineer. And so I'm realizing, oh, it's driving us crazy. He's tape and glue and everything, you know, scissors everywhere. But our structures in our schools are not set up for him to be able to operate in what his natural gifts are. And he's checked out of the curriculum of worksheets and rote memory and a lot of what Dr. Mutegi is talking about. So my question is, does taking back the will look like creating structures within our existing failing systems, or pulling out of the systems and creating our own structures? And if it's the latter, where do we get those resources from? How do we begin to gather those resources, especially if the research community is not completely, well, they're not aligned, right? They're not aligned with these goals of us taking back the will. And we see the failure. So what are the structures so that like my children don't fall through the crack like so many other Black boys and Black girls?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tiffany Price. Let me now yield to Professor Jomo Mutegi. You have 5 minutes to respond to the comments and questions that have been raised. Over to you.
Sure. Okay, thanks, Peter. And thanks, everyone, for the thoughtful questions and the encouraging comments. The first question Kunle asked was about suggestions for Kenya to make use of the formal sector. And I want to be very clear. I don't want to put myself in a position of advising the nation of Kenya on what they should do. But as a Pan-Africanist, I look at anything that we as an African community face as a problem that we need to collectively address. And the identifier of a problem, or even potential identifier of a problem, it doesn't have to be the person who solves the problem. So I look at my role as trying to identify what's going well, what's not going well. And then I have faith in the fact that by sharing that with others, we will collectively come up with solutions. I will say a couple things, though, in that regard. I gave the example of the car being fixed in 15 minutes and how unlikely that is in the States. And I also mentioned that the Geocali is the first place that people go for all their needs, products and services. However, I want to emphasize that all that glitters is not gold. So what the Geocali lacks is the infrastructure that comes by being officially sanctioned by the society, by the state. So even the spaces in which they work, it's unregulated. there's no means of consistently passing on historically accumulated knowledge. It's not the most sanitary of conditions. These are all things that if there was some holistic treatment of the sector, it could actually improve the work of the Jewel College. It seems as though the government-sanctioned state infrastructure is moving in one direction, and in the process leaving out large numbers of people who have just out of necessity created this other infrastructure. It's one thing that might make sense to do is to try to figure out how can we marshal the resources of the state to support what we're already doing through the Jewel College.
3 minutes more, 3 minutes.
Okay. Okay, now the second question, Ildefonse, I believe, asked about readings, and I'm going to add a few more readings to the list that I gave Peter, a list of other books that touch on, I call these books, they're mostly by science writers, which are critiques of Western science. So they're constantly telling us what is wrong with the system that we live in. We just, as science educators, don't make much use of it. The next question was, what language should we adopt throughout Africa? That's clearly out of my realm of expertise. So I'll say just a brief observation. In my experience traveling to Africa, I've been 3 times, and my experience in other countries, only Americans speak one language. So the fact that throughout the continent we speak multiple languages to me is a benefit, and I don't even see a need for us to have only one language. And then the last question that Tiffany asked was, what does taking back the wheel look like? And I don't think it has to be...
Okay, sorry. I will meet Professor Briggs now.
Yes.
Okay, okay. So Professor Briggs, okay. Yeah, please go on. Okay.
Sorry.
So I don't think it has to answer Tiffany's question. It doesn't have to be prescriptive. So there's not one way that we can take back the wheel. Tiffany is a teacher in a public school. She can wrest whatever control is available to her in the space in which she works. A friend of mine, Barudi, runs a private school. He can wrest whatever control is in his space to work. And we can, in these different spaces, collaborate and work together so that where Tiffany has weaknesses, Barudi will have strengths, and they should be able to collaborate and share those strengths and compensate for each other's weaknesses. Same with you on the continent and those in the diaspora. We should be able to marshal our resources in support of what you're doing, and you should be able to marshal your resources in support of what we're doing. And that way, as a collective body, we can make a great deal of progress. I don't think there needs to be any one way of wresting back control.
Thank you so very much. And on that note, we'd like to all collectively, there are 63 people in the class already. Let me unmute us all, and then we'll give the resounding round of applause. So,
If we can send one to us now, maybe I can then compare it with what we have.
So I'm going to everybody again, and then get Professor Nimi Briggs, our grandpa Professor Nimi Briggs, to present the plaque of appreciation to Professor Jomo. Let me mute everybody again. Yeah. So please keep your microphones muted. I will put the plaque on.
I've unmuted my mic. Yes, I have indeed.
You have the floor now.
Yes. Okay. But it's not coming on yet.
Okay. Is it not? I'm sharing the screen.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah, you are sharing now.
Please go on, Professor Briggs.
Yes, I will indeed. Before I read the content of the plaque, I want to take the opportunity to thank the 2 speakers today. I found the 2 lectures today very, very worthwhile, and they were very informative and educative. And they are the root of what we are talking about, actually, to evolve a way in which we Africans can think out our own life and our own prospects so that we can develop on our own terms, irrespective of what the white man has done unto us and for us. So I want to thank Jomo very, very sincerely, and also to our VC of the University of Ibadan for what they have done. And to you, our coordinator, you've been wonderful. Right, I will read the appreciation. It reads appreciation. Lagos State University, Africa Center of Excellence for Innovative and Transformative STEM Education. It's a World Bank supported project. This is to certify that Professor Jomo Mutegi facilitated courses ACE 811 and ACE 911 between April 20 to April 25, 2020. And this is signed by Professor Jomo, Officer of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, his capacity as a director. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Yeah. Yeah, so I wish you all a very nice rest of the week, and bye-bye.